I would not want to preempt, but I would like to hand this session over to Maureen, because we want to create time to hear as much as possible from Daktari. So at this point, I would like once again to welcome everybody on behalf of APA, the medical department, and the senior management of this company. We welcome you abroad. So I hand this session over to Maureen of Chiromo Mental Hospital so that you can usher in Dr. Frank Njenga. Over to you, Maureen.
Thank you, Zainab. Hi, Zainab, yes. Thank you very much, Zainab, for the warm regards. We really appreciate it. My name is Maureen Warungu from Chiromo Hospital Group, formerly Chiromo Lane Medical Center. We are excited to be here to have this conversation on addiction. We pride in these promotive and preventive initiatives with our different partners. And as we mark our 25-year anniversary this year, we are so excited just to continue creating awareness on mental health. Without further ado, I'll just welcome my colleague, Grace Kashanja, who will, of course, help out with this. So, karibu, Grace.
Thank you so much for that, Maureen, and thank you, APA Group. My name is Grace, and I'd like to take this pleasure to introduce Dr. Frank Njenga. Dr. Frank Njenga has been in practice, private practice for the past 21 years, and is an active participant in social, political, and medical fields in Kenya, Africa, and the world. Recently, he chaired the Mental Health Task Force, and the report which recommended that mental health be declared a national emergency of epic proportions. He's currently the presidential advisor of matters mental health, the chairman of Chiromo Hospital Group, AAR group of hospitals in East Africa, and also a field of other things that he's very passionate for. So even as we start this conversation, I'd like to take this pleasure to welcome Dr. Frank Njenga to take us through the conversation below as we continue. Please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A session and we will respond to them at the end of this conversation. Asanteni sana. Karibu, Daktari.
And a very good morning to you all. The intention this morning is to talk for about 40 minutes on this subject of addiction, which will allow, if my instructions are as clear as they could be, allow a conversation, and conversation here means conversation, around this whole subject of addiction and related matters. For those who have a tendency of falling off to sleep during conversations of this nature, I have very, very, very good news for you, because I really have only two things that I'd like you to take home, and I will say them first so that you can go away or fall off to sleep, whatever it is that you choose to do. So the first thing I'd like you to take home is the fact that addiction is a chronic brain disease. I'll say that again for the removal of doubt. Addiction, as understood by medical practitioners, is a chronic brain disease, and not the outward behavior of addiction that you normally see or believe it to be. Indeed, I'd like you to understand that addiction is not the consequence of making poor choices. It's not a disease, it's not a brain disease that catches bad boys and girls. Just like you don't go shopping and pick diabetes or high blood pressure. Addiction is a disease, And in fact, the World Health Organization, in its classification of the various conditions, has a category that is called mental, neurological, and substance use disorders, ranking them at the same level. So that is the first thing I want you to take home. The second thing I'd like you to take home before we start running the slideshow is that addictive behavior replaces all the healthy things that you do. For example, you woke up this morning, presumably showered and logged into this call because it's healthy to come in this morning and want to learn. If you are suffering the disease of addiction, your brain reward system is changed in such a way that nothing gives you pleasure. Not a good steak, not a good conversation with friends, not a good book. The reward system in your brain is so fundamentally changed by the process of addiction that the only thing that gives you pleasure is the drug that you are taking, be it, as we are seeing, the list of drugs that I will be listing in a moment. And the consequence of this is that people who have this disease of addiction continue to indulge in the drug use in spite of the negative consequences. So it is not a lot of echo in the presentation, my goodness me. Let me see if I can cure that. I hope that's better. So it's not reasonable or fair to tell a person who has an addiction, please stop, because they have no conception of what you're talking to them about. Negative promises will not and will never stop an addict from using the drug. So those are the only two important things that I was going to say this morning. And everything else I will say from this moment on is at the level of Maridadi, and just emphasizing those two very, very, very important and critical points. Grace, maybe you can go on to the next slide. So those are the substances that are formally recognized by the American Psychiatric Association in the chapter. Now, again, just like in insurance world, there are standards well established and recognized in the practice of insurance, or indeed for any other discipline. We are regulated in what we call an addiction and what is not an addiction. And the chapter that regulates this conversation of this morning is titled Substance-Related and Addictive Disorders. Next slide, please. As you'll be seeing in a little while, gambling actually qualified to be an addiction disorder a few years ago. It's a bit like a football league. Things can be relegated or promoted into the category of addiction, in a sense, depending on the science that is available. And the science that is now available is very clear that gambling qualifies to be recognized as an addiction. And the reason for that is that the science around addiction and about drugs is, as I've said already, the activation of the brain reward system is messed up completely. Addiction, gambling, like other drug uses, stops or leads to the neglect of normal day-to-day activities, like attending this webinar. The same thing, gambling and or any other substance that you take leads to activities that give you, at least initially, much pleasure. And those who are afflicted by this condition have low levels of self-control by and large. So the next slide shows you that the first item, that is gambling, has qualified into the Super League and is now formally in our classification system. Next slide, Grace. So gambling has made it, so to speak. The other behaviors, Grace, next slide, please. The other behaviors like internet, gaming, sex addiction, like what afflicted good old Tiger Woods, exercise addiction and shopping addiction are still struggling to get recognition as into the league of addictions. As I've said twice before, qualification into the league of addictions is based purely on the scientific data that is available. And those 4 conditions below gambling are kind of like in a waiting room, waiting for the science. But there is quite a lot of evidence that actually people are now getting addicted to the internet, to sex, exercise, and shopping. Next slide, please. Now, there's one other thing that I would like to say right up front. And this is to do with language and definitions. There are substance use disorders. In other words, a normal person who goes on to use addictive substances like alcohol, cannabis, and heroin, there are disorders that follow that use. Now, there is also another concept that I'd like to put up front here, that there are substance-induced disorders. In other words, when you use the substances that I'll be detailing in a minute, you could become, say, intoxicated. Alcohol is we're familiar with. Heroin can do the same with you, to you rather. And then there is a concept of withdrawal. When you don't have enough alcohol or heroin in your system, there is withdrawal. But you can also get depression, psychosis, anxiety, insomnia, and a whole lot of other conditions that are associated or that are induced because you have used these substances. The other matter that causes a lot of confusion, particularly amongst employers and also among insurance companies that insure mental disorders, is that actually we exist in a lane that is a two-way traffic. That means that a mental illness is a risk factor for drug use, meaning that if you've got a depressive illness, or if you've got schizophrenia, or you've got bipolar mood disorder, or any number of mental illnesses, chances that you will become addicted to a drug are extremely high. And we'll be coming back to this point towards the end of this presentation. So you start off with a mental illness, choose anyone that you like, and your chances of developing an addiction is very high indeed. On the other side of the same street is if you start using any of the drugs that we have mentioned, the chances of you developing a mental disorder are also very high. So it doesn't matter whether you start off with a mental disorder or you start with drug use, the destination is virtually the same. Next slide, Grace. So who is at risk? Who is at risk of becoming addicted to drugs? Well, like everything else in biology and physiology and in medicine as a whole, genetics play a very important role. You are what you are, and very much like your mother, your father, your cousins, and so on. The second risk factor is to do with what happens to you psychologically. In these days of Corona, job losses are very common. Grief is very common, and you can't even go and mourn your loved ones because government says stay at home and be sad on your own. Divorce is a risk factor, and so on. Actually, now that I've mentioned this corona thing, the World Health Organization last year in May, I think it was 15th of May, right at the beginning of the pandemic, warned all of us, and many of us didn't listen to what we were being told, that as the pandemic evolves, we must look to flattening the curve, not only of the infections, but of the inevitable mental health consequences, including addictions. That prediction by the World Health Organization has come to be true. To variable extents, we are able to flatten the curve of infections, but little effective action was taken to try and flatten. And what we are seeing now is an epidemic of all manner of mental disorders, including abuse of alcohol, cannabis, and other substances. Coming back to the slide in front of us, psychiatric disorders, I've mentioned these ones, like major depressive disorders, schizophrenia, PTSD, and a whole lot of other factors. I have already said that once you get those conditions, you're likely to try and relieve yourself of the pain of these disorders by taking alcohol or other drugs. We also know that there are social factors that predict the likelihood of getting addicted. Loneliness is the new killer. It is now estimated by the experts that loneliness all over the world, and particularly in the West, is worse as a killer than smoking and lack of exercise. So loneliness is the new killer, particularly for older people. Easy availability of drugs, and this is where government really comes in the attempts to make sure that there is not much by way of drugs in our estates and our villages and our rural and urban areas. Availability of drugs is itself a major risk factor for the development of addiction. Next slide, please. Now, I cannot involve myself in a conversation here today without mentioning young people, adolescents, because the world over, it is known that most drug use has its origins in adolescence. And there are certain groups of young people, the very aggressive ones, can be noticed from the very beginning. Lack of parental supervision. Now, a very, very, very important study was carried out some years ago, I think 10 or 15 years ago in Iceland, that made this second bullet point very, very, very important indeed. It was shown in Iceland that merely by parents knowing where their children were and supervising their free time, just by way of making sure that they were involved in useful activities like sports, reduced the extent of use of drugs and reduced aggressive behavior and conduct disorders. So that second bullet point on parental supervision must not be underestimated as a protective factor. I've talked about drug availability. Academic failure is one that we don't often talk about. Parents and sometimes grandparents are called to go to their children's schools, and they are told your son has not done well, your daughter has not done well in school. Academic failure. Academic failure is a very, very, very important predictor that your son or daughter will go in the direction of drug use. Association with drug abusers, I don't need to say anything about that. It's obvious. And that is why we go back to the second bullet point, knowing who your sons, daughters, or granddaughters hang out with. And then, of course, there's a last bullet point. There are families that oh, a little bit of pombe here, a little bit of cannabis here, a little bit of heroin here. These are subcultural attitudes. And we know that this subcultural attitude held by parents also lead on to acceptance of drug use. Next slide, please. Now, at what point in the life of young people are these risks at their highest? Well, perhaps not surprisingly, and exactly like happened in the flying industry, transitions, taking off and landing, are the most challenging times in air travel. During transition from primary to secondary school, I just threw in one little statistic there because I like to. 50% of all mental disorders can be recognized in children on the day, at the age of 14. In other words, by the time boys and girls reach KCPE, 50% of all the mental disorders that they will be suffering from can be recognized and something done about it. Do we recognize? No. Do we treat them? No. Are we trying to do something about it? Most certainly. And one of those problems, absolutely, is substance, is addiction. Secondly, and this is the other transition, by the time youngsters leave university at the age of 22, 23, whatever it is, 75%, let me repeat that, 75% of all mental disorders, including addictions, could have been recognized if people are made aware of this reality. So 75% of conditions of mental nature can be recognized. Yes, you can get the presentations, don't worry, that's why I'm speaking so quickly. So it is very, very important. This forum that we're having here this morning, if you don't take anything else away, take those numbers and persuade yourself that it is possible to recognize mental disorders that could lead on to addiction very early in life. Next slide, please. So what are the characteristics of a person who is addicted? And again, these are not just stories from Jenga. This is not things that I dreamt up last night. These are things that have been agreed by experts all over the world as the characteristics that define a person who is addicted. And I've just seen in the chat somebody asking, are we able to get a copy of this slide? Yes, you can if you talk to Grace Gachanja nicely. And that is, I have put, the slides are very busy and contain a lot of information. And that is because it is my hope that management will allow people to take these slides and look at them and distribute them to their friends and families. So this is how you recognize that the person has an addiction problem. And the first category is in relation to impairment of control. So when a person continues to take alcohol, despite significant related problems, your supervisor is telling you, your work performance is not good. I'll put you on a PIP, because you continue to drink. You have been coming late because I don't know why you've been coming late, and you continue to drink. That is a sign that you're having impaired control on your drinking or drug use. The third bullet point there is the circuits in your brain have been damaged. In other words, you have no brakes, meaning that you say you're going to drink 2 beers at your local pub at 3 o'clock in the morning when you have gone through almost a crate. You start feeling very sad about it. An addicted person loses control. Then there are repeated relapses. You promise your wife my darling, I love you so, 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 and then you cry a little bit. I will never, ever drink again. If you're an addicted person, you really do mean that you'll never drink again, but you will continue to go back in spite of the consequences. And then there is a whole question of craving with intense desire. When you're in church, when you're at a wedding, when you're at home, after you have made all the promises you've made to your employer, the craving remains very high indeed. An addicted person, and this is the second from the bottom bullet point, has exclusive thoughts about getting the drug. Work doesn't come into it, the children don't come into it, his parents are not. All day, all night, the only thought an addicted person has is a thought about how to obtain and how to use the drug. And because of this very poor control, there is a demand for long-term care. It's not something that you can do very quickly. The next slide, please. The next issue is social impairment. Social impairment relates to your failure to perform major roles. If you're a school-going person at school, if you're a mom or a dad at the family level, if you're a mother, you forget or neglect to do those things that moms are supposed to do. Same as a father. If you're employed, wherever it is that you're employed, addiction removes you from being available to do your work. We've talked about continued use in spite of interpersonal relationship problems, very, very common between husbands and wives with repeated promises. And this is not just for the men. When we see women or mothers or wives who are addicted, interpersonal problems do not seem to be a reason to stop. And then there's the other thing, which is social and recreational activities are given up. You stop going to church, you stop playing golf, you stop visiting your friends and relatives, and finally, withdrawal from the family makes you a socially impaired person. You have no time to go for weddings. You have no time for gurarios. You have no time for funeral. You have nothing. You are not available to the family. The next category, next slide, please, is to do with the taking of risks. We see people who will take major risks, drive when they're heavily drunk, go to places that they shouldn't go to Caromaindo, or wherever that is, drinking there, exposing themselves to hazards and injuries. We know people who, in spite of being told your liver is in serious trouble, your nerves have in serious problem, people being told that this depression that you're suffering from, this state of anxiety, is clearly related to alcohol. That is not enough reason for the addicted person to stop. Well-meaning advice from elders and from the church and from the neighbors and from the in-laws about the wisdom of stopping has no effect or impact on a person who's addicted. And the last bullet point is very important, particularly to APA and the insuring world. Frequent accidents, both at home and on the roads. A lot of people actually break their legs and break their arms and have all manner of injuries at home as well because of the excess use of drugs, particularly older people. Next slide, please. And then these are terms that are well known to all of us. Tolerance, the person requires increasing amounts to achieve the same effect. This means that if 4 tots of whiskey were enough to give you the rest that is demanded by your body, in the course of time, you need half a bottle and eventually a full bottle to achieve the same effect. The other side of the same coin is that the same amount does not give you the high that is demanded by your body. And that is evidence of increasing tolerance. And then, of course, there's a whole question of withdrawal. You wake up in the middle of the night, the alcohol levels have gone down, you start shaking and shivering and sweating until you get the fix that is required by taking a little bit of that drug. And then there are those unfortunate situations where you wake up in the morning and without some alcohol, you cannot function. That is what is called an eye opener. By the time you reach to needing eye opening, then the situation really is quite dire. So as we are coming to the end, next slide, please. What does addiction look like? To most eyes, the use of larger amounts of the substance than you intended to can be. The persistent desire to continue using, the spending of a lot of time in search of a substance, and the fact that when you wake up in the morning all day, all you're thinking about from morning until evening is where to get which drug to use, then things can then be said to be elephant. Next slide, please. So there are quite some interesting myths that I'd like to dispel this morning with your permission. And we're coming to the end now. What are some of the interesting myths around this subject? Well, you know, and I've talked about this one. Oh, drug addict, this is voluntary behavior. It's like you go to shop and you pick up addiction. No, it's not. Some people say that addiction is a character flaw. It is not. I have told you, and I will repeat it. It's a chronic neurological disorder. There's also the myth, and this is a bad and serious myth, that treatment for addiction should be a one-shot deal. In other words, you go once and you're treated by a clever doctor and you never fall ill again. It's a chronic relapsing condition. And when you have a loved one who has an addiction problem, be ready to hang around with them for a long time. Then there's the other conception that there is a magic bullet that treats all forms of addiction. Not true. As I have indicated, the route to addiction is highly variable. Some people get to a station called addiction via mental disorders. Others get there because of addiction, of bereavement. Others get there because of post-traumatic stress disorder, and so on. So really what the skill of the treating person is in identifying the route that one took. But then there's also another myth, which I'd like to dispel at this point, which is that once an addict, always an addict, and you will never recover from addiction. Not true. In the 40 years that I have been around this business, there are thousands of people that have come across our hands and who have been treated for addiction and who are back to being responsible moms and dads. So it's a myth to say that one cannot get better. The next is a very busy slide. I will not go into it. I have already promised that you can have all these slides, and is intended just to repeat some of the things that we have said with regard to the risk factors and the major causes of substance use. So just go through that one with your friends and family, see which ones apply to you. Next slide, please. And there's a nice, easy test that you can actually do on yourself to see, particularly with regards to alcohol, if things have become gone out of control. So answer yes or no. Only answer in your heart. You don't have to tell anybody else, because otherwise they laugh at you or in some other ways look down on you. So the first question is, have you ever felt you should cut down on your drinking? What is the answer? Answer to your heart. The next question is, have people around you, there read husband or wife or mother or son, have people annoyed you by criticizing your drinking, so that when your husband or when your wife says, the way you drank yesterday at that party, I think you're really misbehaving. Have you been annoyed by people who have made comment? If that applies to you, you are perhaps on your way, just being annoyed by people making comment about your drinking. Number 3 is, have you ever felt bad or guilty? You wake up in the morning, you know you are too drunk to drive and you still drove the company car. Have you felt guilty about not being able to present an assignment to your boss because of a hangover that happened to you over the weekend? Have you ever felt bad or guilty about your drinking? You know what? If that applies to you, you are on your way to the highway of addiction. And number 4, we have talked about already. If ever you have had to wake up in the morning to a drink, then really you need help. So that's an easy test that you can administer to yourself. And if your answer is yes, perhaps you could talk to some of the people at Chiromo Hospital Group. They might be able to be of some help to you in this regard. Next slide. The next 2 or 3 slides are about gambling. The only reason I have given gambling the prominence is because he is the newest kid on the classification block. And people are not as many people as we know are aware of the fact that gambling is an addiction. The other thing is just driving around the city before Corona, the number of gambling houses, to me, appears to be very large. Next slide, please. So, and those are the symptoms of a person addicted to gambling. And I can tell you, there are more people addicted to gambling than you dare believe. Those people who play golf will have seen caddies on their phone all the time and forgetting to look out for the ball. Many of them are actually gambling in various sites. And a lot of mothers, a lot of youngsters gamble online. So that is a list of symptoms that one can see. Number 9 is a very important one for parents to take note of. Children consistently asking for money is an important and early sign of a gambling disorder. I can see questions are beginning to come. Next slide, very quickly. All these slides are available to you. What is the relationship between gambling and substance use? Well, the relationship between gambling and alcohol is very close indeed. People who gamble drink a large amount when they win to celebrate, and they also drink even larger amounts when they lose. The relationship between gambling and substance use. All right, next slide, please. Next slide, please. All these slides are available to you. So at the end of the day, and this is perhaps my second last slide, where does this problem of addiction hurt you the most? It has impact on your behavior and in your mental health, causing you all those listed conditions: depression, aggressive behavior, threats of suicide, anxiety, and so on. It has, on the right-hand side of this slide, impact on your finances. Not only will you likely lose your job, but you're also likely to spend money you don't have. And then, of course, there are physical consequences, including neurological disorders. Next slide, please. Again, this is something that you're welcome to discuss either at work or at home or in your clubs or in your JAMA. These are the consequences of addiction that are well known. Serious challenges of bringing up children, financial difficulties, occupational impact on the right-hand side of this slide, absenteeism, job-related accidents. In fact, there's a time we used to teach that one of the ways that one can tell the health of a manufacturing company is the number of accidents that are reported both at the place of work and also at outside in the world. Number of accidents is actually a very good indicator of occupational stress. Right, this is perhaps the last slide. Management, well, I mean, Grace, do you want to say very, very, very quickly about how we intervene in terms of therapy? Very quickly, you have just 1.5 minutes, Grace.
All right, thank you for that, Dr. So when it comes to management of substance use disorders, as Dr. alluded to earlier, a lot of the issues that are leading up to substances are because of other underlying issues. Most people don't start going into drinking, into smoking just directly. Sometimes it's because of other underlying issues such as depression, such as trauma, such as post-traumatic stress disorder. And during therapy, we work on unpacking these reasons, and also maybe through therapy such as cognitive behavior therapy, so that we understand how exactly, and we help the person understand how exactly has the use of substances been affected by some of the issues that this person has gone through, maybe trauma, maybe depression, maybe using substances to cope with anxiety and the like. Further to that, through therapy, the client also learns how to unlearn the behavioral patterns that he had gone into. If it's things such as managing stress by drinking, then he also learns skills to better cope with stress, better deal with his depression, better deal with some of the traumas that he has been into, so that he learns new behavioral patterns and his brain relearns how to deal with stress, how to deal with anxiety, and all these other issues that may be present underlying. And also focusing on also other skills such as that help to reduce the urge either to drink or to gamble, such as the alcohol refusal skills, and maybe other skills to delay drinking, such as how to distract yourself and things like that. Up to you, Dr.
Okay, thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. I was looking at the questions that are here with us. Lynette asked a question which you have just answered about how can you help a person who is addicted to alcohol and gambling? I think that's the last thing you said. Don't be asked. Dr. mentioned that by a certain age, there are ways to deduce one's propensity to addiction. What are the symptoms? I think these ones I have mentioned. What are the differences between drug addiction and dependent? This field of addiction and dependence has more names and more words that shed a lot of heat in conversation than they shed light. And that is why we said that now the title of the chapter in the system that we use is called Substance-Related and Addictive Disorders. Lay people use the two terms addiction and dependence interchangeably, and that's perfectly in order. But we in the medical fraternity are now required to discuss substance-related and addictive disorders as exists in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. I will allow you to use those two terms interchangeably. The next question is gone. It was from somebody called Flora. How can someone prevent his or herself from gambling and excess drinking? Well, I think the answer was implied in the conversation when we talked about risk factors. Obviously, there are some risk factors that you can do something about and others that you cannot do anything about. For example, you cannot change your genes or the parentage that you got from your parents, but it is possible to improve on your self-management skills. It's possible to elevate your self-esteem through contact with certain people. It's also possible to reduce drug use by getting yourself treated for the mental disorders we talked about, and many other. Grace, do you want to say something about that?
No,
all right,
not
that's perfect, Nora. So, okay, Pat Koech is asking, I would like to know, once one has bipolar mood disorder and is addicted to alcohol and has undergone Alcoholics Anonymous and detox, but goes back to drinking heavily after rehabilitation, which approach can one look at as now family has lost hope? You know, what we said is that addiction is a chronic brain disorder. And the reality is families do not give up when their fathers or mothers or relatives have hypertension that goes on for 3 or 4 decades. In a similar manner, and that is why we call this a disease now, we will try and persuade people that if your loved one has a chronic brain disorder, such as an addiction, really you may not give up on them, because as we said during this particular presentation, people don't get addicted as a matter of choice. People don't get addicted because they are bad people. People get that. So if you have got a bipolar mood disorder, and in the context of a bipolar mood disorder, as I said before, you are more predisposed to the development of addiction, then you must get that person to an expert or a doctor and get it treated. Let me emphasize again and again that if the bipolar mood disorder is not properly or adequately treated, then the chances that you will continue being addicted is very high indeed. So the correct thing is to get that bipolar mood disorder properly treated. Margaret Derito is asking, at time we have tried to talk to our children, but they ignore or they disappear for a while. What are you supposed to do? Well, that is not a good idea to just cry about it. But remember what I said about the study from Iceland. The study from Iceland is a very, very important study because it confirms what all parents know, but there was no scientific backing for, which is that really parental involvement in the care of their children, in particular adolescents, is a very important and critical protective factor against drug use and mental disorders. So, Margaret, all I can say is get involved, stay involved, and know where your children are up to and who they're talking to. Agura Vivian is asking, how does individual attitude relate to addiction? I mentioned this one in passing, where I said there are families and there are societies and communities that really do not have a strong attitude about drug or alcohol use. And it is all known that if your community has a very easy approach towards the use of drugs, then the chances of those members of that community being addicted are very high. Then Okoth Ojuala says the following: thank you, Dr. Njenga and Grace, on this informative session. Mental health is an impending pandemic. I couldn't agree with you more in our country. Unfortunately, the government and ministry is giving less effort. Not true. As you were told at the beginning, no other than the president appointed me to advise him directly on mental health issues after we released the report that, again, you've been told. Do you provide training on mental health, drugs and substance abuse? Yes. Chiromo Hospital Group has a program. You're welcome to talk to Grace Gachanja about it. It encourages people who work in HR or people who work with people. In fact, we have twinned with Amref International University on a postgraduate diploma to do this. The last question is there support for referrals? Again, the answer is a most definite yes. And Grace will be able to give you the appropriate contact at the end of this. Agnes Kivuti says, hi, Dr. Njenga. What can you advise on aged parents living alone up country and one develops withdrawal and bitterness, even triggered by minor needs? Well, Agnes, let me tell you, it really depends on how much you love your old parents. As I've said, the World Health Organization is very clear on this matter. One of the effective ways of killing your parents is to make sure that they are lonely. The converse of which is that one of the ways to keep your parents alive is to make them not lonely. Really, loneliness has been underestimated, now turns out, as a cause of death, particularly in the elderly. So I think the correct answer is that depending on whether your parents are your friends or not, treat them for the loneliness. Agnes is asking, no, that one we have answered. Actually, there's a question. Actually, Agnes is also asking about elderly parents being very, very irritable. Loneliness does lead to a lot of irritability. Lydia Minor says, given the chronicity of addiction, is it accurate to say that there are some people who will not recover from addiction, irrespective of the interventions made, for example, being in a treatment center for more than once or twice a year, even more? Two answers to one question. Just like we know for a fact that not all insurance companies are the equivalent of APA. APA is a tier 1 insurance companies. There are companies that call themselves insurance companies that are in a different league. Treatment and rehabilitation centers are the same. You can't, if you go to a tier 3 or tier 4 rehabilitation unit and you don't get better, it may be one of two things. One, it may be that your condition is very severe and intractable. In the alternative, it may be that you have gone to a division 3 rehabilitation center where the care you get is inappropriate. Actually, when we did a mapping of rehabilitation centers in this country, when I chaired the mental health task force, this was one of our findings, that people have little units, kitchens, and little bandas that they call rehabilitation units. Those ones are not, do not qualify. However, and this is also true, there are people who, in spite of taking them to tier 1 rehabilitation centers, will have problems. So really, first, make sure you take your loved ones to a proper registered rehabilitation center. And secondly, be sure that any underlying conditions receive the attention that they deserve. Finally, is there a medication for insomnia? or must one have to take alcohol? Eric Otieno. Eric, alcohol makes you unconscious. It doesn't give you sleep. In fact, Eric, if you've ever drunk pombe, you will know that when you use alcohol to help you sleep, you wake up in the morning feeling very tired and very irritable and with a very severe headache. You have not been sleeping, you have been unconscious. So don't ever use alcohol to induce a state of what appears like sleep. Get yourself treated for the reason of the insomnia. This is the last one I will say. It comes from Lydia Minor. And thank you, Daktari, for being so resourceful. And Yvonne Asangira says, Daktari, is there such a thing as social media addiction? Yes, there is. And there are lots of people who are addicted to it, but that has not yet qualified in the classification of diseases to be registered as such. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. It's now exactly 9 o'clock. And the clock says we must now go away and do other things. Thank you for all those wonderful questions. And Grace, please make sure that anybody who is interested has a copy of this presentation. It's for anybody who's interested in it. And feel free to distribute it as far and as widely as you deem it appropriate. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful morning. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you so much, Grace and Daktari. We really appreciate the session today. I believe our viewers have learned something to take home. We want to thank you so much. We know Daktari is busy and we finished exactly 9 on the dot. And on behalf of APA Insurance Management, the APA medical team, and Chiromo Lane and Daktari, we want to wish you a very lovely day and may God bless you.